Hello, and welcome to another Behind the Poem story. I have a somewhat ironic poem on multiple levels to talk to you about tonight, and it's the poem name called I'm Not to Blame from my first collection, Between Hindsight and Foresight. If you have been watching my other videos, or if you'd like to go and look at my other videos, I'm Not to Blame is a poem that was part of a university assignment. I had done a module on reading poetry, and as part of our assignment, we were told we could do either an essay, a researched essay on poetry or poetry forms or particular poets, or instead we could take all the learning from reading poetry that we'd done that module and complete a series of poems that were meant to reflect the learning that we had achieved that term. Being a poet and having someone who has been writing poetry since I was about 14, I chose the option to write a short collection of poems and the analysis underneath each of the poems to talk about which part of the module that was reflecting, which part of the module or which poem or poet was reflected by the poetry attempt. So this is the same university assignment that produced Fear. So if you have not watched my video on Fear, please feel free. That one was intended to imitate William Blake. I'm Not to Blame was meant to almost be in the persona of one of the poems that we had read, one of the voices that we had read. It was meant to be the voice of Madam Bovary. Now, if you don't know Madam Bovary, please do feel free to, investigate. She's quite an interesting character, but her voice in this poem was intended to be kind of focused on telling us about her dissatisfaction with her life. Originally, it was meant to convey and symbolize all the different roles, all the different parts of her complaints, roles that she both idealized and failed at. And so when she failed at her idealized version of the role, these complaints were meant to deny or pass over those roles as meaningless because she couldn't do them. So I want to read you the original version because it's much, much shorter, and it's a lot more simplistic, and you can almost hear the voice of a kind of a complaining woman in it. This is the original version that was submitted for a university assignment. I'm not to blame. My husband is cold and unsatisfying, so I cheat. I'm not to blame. My house is falling apart. Bad maid. I'm not to blame. We're running low on funds, but we must be in high fashion, so I still spend. I'm not to blame. Society demands it. My child is difficult. I have my own problems. I'm not to blame. I think more. I was educated, so I am dissatisfied with middle class. I'm not to blame. I wanted love. I wanted romance. I wanted upper class. I was denied everything. So I deny you. I'm not to blame. So as you can hear in that, it was obviously she was middle class, she was wanting to be upper class, and so many of the roles that she was going for were beyond her in some way. And her complaints shove the blame of what she's not, or what she wants to be but fails at, onto someone else. Not anyone in particular, not one person, not groups of people. And I think that when I revised this poem, it became was not a representation of Madame Bovary and her complaints, or a particular woman's complaints or particular person's complaints on dissatisfaction. I decided when I revised it to be the new version, which is longer and in the collection, that it felt to me almost like it needed to be updated to reflect more modern feelings about a lack of personal responsibility. Now, I'm not going to deny that, like, my teaching and my teaching of teenagers has possibly influenced the alterations I made to the poem, and the constant thing that happens where it's always someone else's fault. Whatever's going wrong, whatever is lacking, however you are changing or shifting, it's always someone else's responsibility. It's always the teacher's responsibility to make sure that the student passes, even if the student doesn't work. It's always families' responsibility to teach the student manners, even if the parents are perfectly lovable and their family is perfectly supportive, and the child still doesn't seem to clap on to the concept of manners. So my interaction with students and seeing a serious pushing off of responsibility really affected me when I went to revise this poem. So in our lives we see it all the time, and frequently in the news we see other more celebrity characters, more celebrity people blaming anyone but themselves, claiming things that are not true. So this epidemic of fake news. If someone is misled, they blame the information that they received. It doesn't matter that the information they received was dead wrong, and it was obvious it was dead wrong if they took 5 seconds to check it with a more reputable source. It's always someone else's fault. The internet, a celebrity personage, a friend, a email, some kind of random thing they heard on the street. It's always someone else's fault that justifies their bad behavior. So when I did the new version, that was what I was thinking about, both my viewing of teenagers and my viewing of society in general. Now, I'm not to blame for other people doing this, but I try very hard and don't always succeed in cutting this out of my own personality. We all have that tendency to want it to be someone else's fault when we do something wrong. We want it to be an explainable, preventable thing. And anytime a disaster happens, anytime something goes wrong, we want to find a reason why it has occurred. We want to blame something, someone or something for causing the hurt to ourselves, to loved ones, to society in general. And as many times as you'll hear someone with a problem, you'll hear 50 different people with 50 different explanations as to how it was preventable or why or whose fault it was. Sometimes bad things just happen. Sometimes you can do everything right and still make a mistake. And it's important not to never make a mistake, not to ever step out of line, but it's important to accept that something bad has happened, and either accept the responsibility, if you can be honest with yourself that it was you that is responsible for it, or to avoid blaming someone else, even if it was their fault, because it's not helpful. Assigning blame is not helpful. Bringing people, making people accountable, making people culpable for something that they've done is fine. But blaming someone needlessly when there's absolutely nothing to do about it now is kind of a waste of energy. So the different things that I put into this reflect all those different views and all that experience that I gained since university on that blame culture idea. And they run through kind of the everyday to the important. So the keeping the house in order is with the first verse. Whose responsibility is it to do the dishes? Whose responsibility is it to make sure the place is clean? If you live alone, is there anybody else to do it? So the whole kind of concept of keeping your house in order and keeping your space clear. If you don't want to do it, or you don't do it, somebody's got to. And if there's nobody else to do it, well, it's your own fault if it's wrong. Cheating on a partner. Now, there's any number of a bazillion excuses that people who do cheat on their partners come up with. But in the end, you always have a choice as to whether you go through with something like that. Calling in sick to work when you're not. I think this probably stems from my experience at a pub when I first moved to England, and I knew that people would call out sick when they weren't because they wanted to go out for the night, just somewhere else. And that really upset me, particularly when there was a time I needed to call off because I was ill, or because genuinely ill, or because I had to get in contact with my family or whatever. There was a reason, an actual real reason I needed to be off work, but I couldn't because someone already had, and I knew for a fact that that person was not genuinely ill. There are, in one of the verses, there are gripes about, people taking our jobs. And again, that probably stems from my experience at the pub, where being an immigrant, being originally from America and living here for several years, I was working a regular job, and I was just trying to get by, and people were accusing me of coming over and taking my jobs. And but I don't mean you. I was an exception. And of course, the one that stems from school, unruly children, and parenting or schools, or whose responsibility is it to mold this child into a reasonable human being. So a variety of different things are explored in this poem about blame and responsibility, and how we should probably take a closer reflective look on the causes and whether or not finding blame is helpful, or if we should just worry about finding solutions. So if you hated this rambly video, or you hate any of the videos that I've put which tell you the story behind my poems, I'm not to blame. You can just stop listening. Although I would enjoy it if you continue to listen and see the stories behind the rest of the poems in my collection, Between Hindsight and Foresight. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.